The sound was small, so small it almost didn't exist. But it froze David Miller right where he stood. He had just stepped into his mansion, coat still on, briefcase in hand, when he heard it. A voice. A child's voice. For 2 years, that house had known only silence. No crying, no laughter, no words. Just machines humming, clocks ticking, and the quiet that grief leaves behind. But now there it was again. Ma. Ma. David's fingers went numb. The briefcase slipped a little in his hand. He turned slowly toward the sound coming from the living room. His twin sons, Ethan and Ryan, the boys who couldn't walk, couldn't talk. The boys doctors said would never call anyone's name or sitting upright, facing someone. And that someone was the maid. Sarah Johnson knelt on the floor, yellow cleaning gloves still on, whispering softly to them. Her voice was low, calm, almost like a song. The twins' tiny arms reached toward her, their lips trembling as they tried again. Ma. David felt something move inside his chest, something he had buried a long time ago. The word echoed through the quiet mansion like thunder hiding inside a whisper. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched from the doorway as his sons reached not for him but for the woman he barely knew. The maid. Sarah didn't turn around. She didn't even know he was there. She kept her eyes on the boys, whispering, "It's okay, baby. Try again. I'm right here." And somehow they did. They tried again. Ma. David's breath caught. His world tilted. For the first time since his wife died, he felt his hands shake not from anger or work, but from something he didn't understand. Hope. He stepped back quietly, before anyone saw him. The door clicked shut behind him, soft but final. He stood in the empty hallway, heart heavy, ears ringing with one impossible sound that would not stop echoing inside him. Ma? What just happened? Who was this maid? And how did she do what the best doctors in America couldn't? David Miller stood in the middle of the hallway long after the echo of that tiny voice faded. He had spent 2 years trying to fill the quiet with order timetables, nurses, expensive machines, perfect schedules. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was alive now, as if it had heard something he could not control. He placed his briefcase on the floor and pressed both hands against the wall. His breath came slow, unsure. His sons had spoken. At least, he thought they had. Maybe he was losing his mind. He forced himself to walk toward his study. Each step sounded loud against the marble. Pictures of his late wife, Linda, lined the corridor. In every photo she was smiling, holding the twins when they were still small and whole, before the hospital words nerve damage, paralysis, speech lost over their lives. David stopped in front of the last frame. "You would have heard it too," he whispered. I swear they said something. He sat at his desk, but couldn't open his laptop. Numbers, meetings, profits, none of it mattered now. The sound Ma kept rolling through his head like a heartbeat. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe it was just noise. Maybe Sarah the maid had trained them to make sounds. But even that didn't make sense. How could a maid, hired 3 weeks ago, do what trained therapists couldn't? He rubbed his forehead and stared at the window overlooking the Hudson Garden. The autumn air moved the curtains slightly, letting in a chill. Everything in that house was expensive furniture from Italy, floors polished every morning, but none of it felt alive. Until now. He needed answers. The next morning, David didn't go to the office. He dressed quickly and waited by the hallway until he heard footsteps from the nursery. Sarah's soft humming came first. Then the quiet laugh of a nurse. He stayed out of sight, watching through the half-open door. Sarah knelt by the crib, wearing her plain gray uniform. Her hair was tied neatly in a low bun. The twins sat on the floor cushions beside her, heads slightly tilted, eyes following her every move. She spoke to them as if they understood every word. "Good morning, Ethan." "Good morning, Ryan." "It's a new day, baby boys," she said with a gentle smile. "Let's try our stretches, Her voice was warm, no rush, no fear, no medical words. She moved their arms slowly, whispering small jokes only they could hear. Ethan's hand twitched. Ryan blinked twice. To anyone else it was nothing, but to David it felt like a miracle happening in slow motion. The nurse took notes, uninterested. Sarah didn't care who was watching. She kept speaking softly, tapping lightly on the boys' palms. Then she began to hum the same tune David had heard the night before, the lullaby Linda used to sing. His chest tightened. Where did she learn that song? He muttered under his breath. He stayed until the boys grew sleepy again. Sarah tucked a thin blanket around them, patted their backs, and whispered, "You did well today. Mama's proud." David stepped back before she turned. The word "mama" burned in his ears. At lunch, he asked one of the nurses casually, "How long has the new maid been here?" "3 weeks, sir," the nurse replied. Why do the boys react to her? The nurse shrugged. Maybe they like her voice. Sometimes they smile when she sings. It's nothing medical, nothing medical, David repeated quietly. He dismissed her and walked to his late wife's old piano room. Dust covered the keys. He pressed one finger down, the note rang sharp in the empty space. He could almost hear Linda saying, "They just need love, David, not walls." He had built so many walls around the house, around himself. That evening, he stood outside the nursery again. The lights were dim. Sarah was writing in a small notebook on her lap while the boys slept. He knocked gently. She looked up, calm. "Mr. Miller," she said, standing quickly. "Is something wrong?" "I heard them say something yesterday," he said. "A word. I thought I imagined it." Sarah closed the notebook slowly. "They did say a word," she replied. 2 times. David's throat tightened. "How?" "They've been trying for days. I talk to them even when they can't answer. I tell them stories, songs. Yesterday they found a sound that felt safe." He frowned. "Safe?" She nodded. "Children don't speak because we teach them. They speak because they feel safe enough to try." Her words hit harder than she probably meant them to. He looked at the twins, peaceful, breathing softly. He had given them doctors, machines, schedules, but never safety. "You were hired to clean," he said after a pause. "I still do," she answered quietly. "But sometimes, while I clean, they listen." The room fell silent. David didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to fire her, to end this confusion. Another part wanted to ask her to never stop. He turned toward the door. "Don't let this distract you from your duties." "I won't, sir," she said softly. "But I'll keep talking to them. It helps." He didn't respond. He just nodded once and left. But as he walked down the hallway, he realized something had changed. The silence in the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt waiting. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of Sarah's calm face wouldn't leave his mind, nor the sound of the twins' voices. He had spent years believing love was something he could control with money and rules. But what if love was something he had to listen to instead? He closed his eyes, whispering the word he had heard the night before. Ma. And for the first time in 2 years, he let the sound make him cry. The next morning came heavy with rain. Thin drops hit the tall glass windows of the Miller estate, each one sounding louder than the last. David sat alone in his study, staring at the gray sky. His coffee had gone cold. His laptop screen glowed with unread emails, but he couldn't focus on numbers anymore. All night, he had replayed that word in his mind, Ma. Every time he heard it, something in him shook. He needed answers. He needed someone to tell him it was real or that it wasn't. At 9 o'clock sharp, the front door buzzer broke the silence. The new specialist had arrived. Dr. Thomas Reed, tall, neatly dressed, with a voice that carried more confidence than kindness. David had met dozens of men like him before, men who spoke in medical codes and looked at children as projects. They sat in the drawing room. Rain tapped softly against the large windows. Dr. Reed flipped through a thick folder of the twins' medical files. His face stayed blank. I read the notes from your nursing team, he said calmly. Someone recorded new vocal attempts? David nodded slowly. Yes. 2 days ago. They said a word. The doctor's brow lifted. A word? Yes. Ma. They reached out toward the maid while saying it. The maid? Reed repeated, half smiling. Mr. Miller, you're under a lot of emotional stress. I understand how easy it is to I heard it, David interrupted. His voice came out firm, almost sharp. I was standing right there. Red didn't argue. He simply crossed his legs and said, children with their condition may produce random sounds. Reflexes, not language. David leaned forward. It didn't sound random. The doctor closed the file gently. Hope can make the mind play tricks, sir. But if you wish, I can evaluate them again. He stood up and straightened his coat. Where are they? David led him to the nursery. Sarah was inside, folding the twins' small clothes into perfect squares. She looked up, surprised to see the 2 men. Morning, Mr. Miller, she said politely. Morning, Doctor. Dr. Reed nodded. Good morning. I just need to observe the boys for a few minutes. Sarah stepped aside, quiet but watchful. The doctor bent near the twins, clapped twice, spoke loudly, made notes on a pad. Ethan blinked once. Ryan turned his head slightly. Nothing else. After 10 minutes, Reed straightened up. No vocal response, he said flatly. No indication of purposeful speech. David's jaw tightened. You were here for 10 minutes. That's all I needed, the doctor replied. They are responding to sound, not meaning. I'll adjust the therapy plan. He shook David's hand, gathered his things, and left as fast as he came. The house door closed, leaving a new kind of silence behind. Sarah returned to her spot beside the cribs. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at the twins, her eyes soft, patient. David stood at the doorway, frustration written all over his face. They didn't make a sound, he said quietly. They don't perform for strangers, she replied. Her calm tone irritated him more than shouting ever could. You think I imagined it? No, she said, still not looking up. I think they speak when they feel safe. He crossed his arms. Safe? You mean I make them afraid? Sarah turned then, slowly. No, but you keep a wall between you and them. They feel it, even if they can't explain it. He looked down. unsure what to say. I've done everything right. The best doctors, the best nurses, every machine they said we needed. She nodded gently. Yes, sir. Everything money could buy. The words cut deep, but she didn't mean them cruelly. She said them like truth, not judgment. He wanted to end the conversation. Instead, he found himself asking, "What did you do differently?" Sarah hesitated, then answered, "I sit with them. I touch their hands. Sometimes I sing." She smiled faintly. Children remember songs before they remember faces. He frowned. You mean music therapy? No, I mean love. The words hung between them, heavier than the rain outside. Later that night, David couldn't sleep. He walked through the hallway, past the quiet portraits of Linda, past the piano that hadn't been played since the funeral. He stopped near the nursery door again. He heard Sarah's voice soft, steady, carrying that same song Linda used to hum. He pushed the door slightly open. The twins were asleep, their little fingers wrapped around each other. Sarah sat on the floor beside them, humming the tune so gently it felt like the air itself was listening. David's throat tightened. "How do you know that song?" he asked. Sarah turned slowly. "What song?" "The one you were just singing. My wife used to hum it when she was pregnant. It's not from any book or movie." Sarah looked at the bookshelf, then reached for something behind the toys, a thin notebook with worn. She handed it to him. "I found it," she said quietly. "Behind the crib. It has her handwriting. There are recipes, small notes, and that song." David flipped through the pages. Linda's writing, clear and neat, stared back at him. "For when I'm not there." He froze. The same words were written on the first page. Sarah spoke softly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I just thought maybe the house needed music again." For a long moment, David said nothing. He sat down on the floor beside her, the cold marble under his knees. The silence between them was not empty this time. It was full of everything he hadn't said in years. He looked at his sons, then at the maid who somehow knew his wife's song. And for the first time, David Miller, the man who built an empire out of control and silence, felt his heart break in a way that didn't destroy him. It opened him. The next morning the sky was clear again, but inside the house the air felt heavy. David sat in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around a cup he wasn't drinking from. He had spent most of the night staring at that notebook, Linda's words, Linda's song, Linda's hope for the boys. Sarah had brought something back into the house he thought was gone forever. Now he didn't know what to do with it. From the nursery came the sound of laughter, soft, uneven, but real. He rose slowly and walked toward it. Sarah was on the floor, helping Ethan balance a colored block on top of another while Ryan watched. When the tower fell, both boys made a noise that almost sounded like a giggle. Sarah clapped quietly. "Good job, baby. Try again." She didn't see David standing at the door. He wanted to speak, but his throat was tight. He hadn't heard laughter in that house since Linda died. For a long time he just stood there, letting the sound soak through him. Later, when the boys napped, Sarah cleaned the play mats and folded the blankets. David stepped inside. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked up. "Yes, sir. Do you believe they'll ever talk properly?" Sarah thought before answering. "I believe they already are trying. They just need time, patience, and people who don't give up." He nodded slowly. "I didn't believe in anything for a long time." Her eyes softened. Grief can make a person forget what hope sounds like. David stared at the sleeping twins. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she said. "It's just worth it." That evening, a white envelope sat on the kitchen counter addressed to Sarah Johnson. It had the logo of St. Mary's Neurological Institute, Albany. When she opened it, her eyes widened slightly. It was an offer 3 times her pay, housing included, and a chance to train with their therapy team. They called her work Exceptional Instinct. She folded the paper quietly and slipped it into her notebook. David found her later, wiping the dining table. "You got a letter," he said. She froze for a moment, then smiled politely. "Yes, sir. Just a job offer. Are you taking it?" "I don't know yet." The room fell silent, except for the ticking wall clock. David crossed his arms. "Why would you leave now, when they finally started changing?" She lowered her eyes. "Because sometimes people like me don't get chances twice. And because they're not mine, Mr. Miller." Her voice was steady, but there was sadness underneath. David felt a sudden panic he didn't understand. "They trust you," he said quietly. "They reach for you." "I know," she replied. "That's what makes this hard." He turned away, unable to look at her. "If you leave, it will break them." She wiped the last corner of the table. "Then help them before I have to." For the next few days, the house felt strange. Sarah still came to work, but she was quieter. The twins grew restless. Ethan refused his afternoon nap. Ryan cried whenever she stepped out of sight. Even the nurses whispered about it. Something in the air had changed. David noticed everything. He stopped working late and stayed home more, watching from the doorway as Sarah played with the boys. He wanted to ask her to stay, but pride kept his words trapped. He didn't know how to say please. One afternoon, he walked into the nursery holding a folder. "I had something drawn up," he said, placing it beside her. Sarah glanced at it, a legal document printed on thick paper. "What is this?" "Shared guardianship," he said softly. "Not full, not binding. Just a way to show you're part of this family, if you want to be." She looked at him in shock. "Mr. Miller, you don't have to know what I don't have to do," he interrupted. "But I'm doing it anyway." She opened the folder. Inside was a small handwritten note clipped to the last page. "You're part of this, whether or not you want a title." Sarah closed it carefully. "I need time to think," she said. David nodded. "Take all the time you need." That night, a storm rolled in from the river. Wind rattled the windows. The lights flickered once. Sarah stayed upstairs with the twins. They were frightened by thunder. David stood at the door, watching as she held them close, humming that same old tune. "Jay." The sound came from Ryan's lips. Sarah froze. David's eyes widened. "Say it again," she whispered. "Jay." It was soft, broken, but it was sound. "That's him trying to say my name," she said, tears filling her eyes. Before David could answer, Ethan joined in, pushing himself up on weak elbows. "Jay. Ma." The words hit David like lightning. They weren't just sounds. They were choice. Recognition. The boys were calling the two people who had never left them. Sarah's eyes met his. "They're choosing," she said. "Not out of habit, out of love." David stepped closer, his voice shaking. "Then don't leave." She looked down at the boys. They had both fallen asleep against her chest, peaceful even as thunder echoed outside. "I won't," she said quietly. "Not tonight." The next morning the storm was gone. Sunlight poured through the curtains, making everything glow. Sarah placed the signed guardianship papers on the kitchen counter. No words, just the sound of paper sliding across marble. David picked it up, stunned. "You're staying?" She smiled softly. "They asked me to." He wanted to thank her but couldn't find the right words. Instead, he simply said, "Welcome home." Sarah nodded. "Let's make it one." 6 months passed quietly inside the Miller estate, but the silence no longer felt like it used to. It wasn't the kind that hurt anymore. It was the kind that listened. David Miller still woke up early each day, but not for meetings or calls. He woke up because he could hear life again, small sounds that once never existed here. The shuffle of feet. The gentle hum of Sarah's voice from the nursery. The faint laughter of his twin sons, Ethan and Ryan. The house that used to echo with nothing but grief was now full of small, soft noises that meant everything. Sarah was still the same, humble, calm, and focused. She didn't change her uniform or her ways. But everyone could feel the difference she brought. The nurses smiled more. The boys looked brighter. Even the sunlight felt warmer inside the rooms she entered. David often found himself standing by the doorway, watching her. Not as an employer watching his maid, but as a man watching someone who had rebuilt his world without even meaning to. One morning, Sarah spread a blanket near the Hudson garden, letting the boys sit under the open sky. It was their first time out there since the storm. Ethan blinked at the sunlight, squinting like it was new. Ryan touched the grass with his hand and smiled faintly. David stood a few steps behind, afraid to move, afraid to break the moment. Sarah whispered softly, "The world's not scary, my loves. It just needs to know you're not afraid to meet it." Ethan reached for a dandelion. His hand missed, but his eyes stayed fixed on it. Sarah guided his hand slowly until his fingers touched the stem. Ryan let out a tiny laugh, a sound that made David's chest ache in the best way possible. For the first time in years, his sons were living, not surviving, but living. And it had nothing to do with money, therapy, or doctors. It was presence. It was love. Later that afternoon, Sarah came inside with the boys and their small drawings, crooked lines, shapes and colors that made no sense to anyone but them. She taped the papers on the kitchen wall proudly. David watched her and said quietly, "You treat everything they do like it matters." Sarah smiled. "Because it does." He nodded slowly. "I spent 2 years building walls around this house. You turned them into doors." She didn't reply. She just went back to feeding the twins, one spoonful at a time. The boys' 3rd birthday came on a mild spring afternoon. There was no press, no reporters, no grand party. Just a few family friends, one nurse and Margaret Lewis, Linda's sister, who hadn't visited since the funeral. Sarah baked a small white cake herself. Ethan and Ryan wore soft blue shirts, their hands sticky with icing. David sat on the patio, watching the boys play with colorful balloons. For the first time in years, he smiled without forcing it. Margaret walked over to Sarah and asked kindly, "Are you the nanny?" Sarah hesitated, unsure what to say. Before she could answer, Ethan wobbled forward, touched her leg, and whispered something. "Ma." It was quiet, almost too soft to hear, but it was there. Ryan copied him a second later. "Mama." Everyone froze. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. David's eyes filled instantly. Margaret covered her mouth, whispering, "Oh my God." Sarah knelt down, tears welling up but refusing to fall. She stroked their cheeks gently. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." David looked at her across the garden. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. Yes. They see you. I do too. That night, after everyone left, David helped Sarah clean up the small pieces of cake and balloons. The twins were already asleep. He walked into the nursery holding the old notebook, the one with Linda's handwriting. "She would have liked you," he said softly. Sarah looked at the floor. "I'm not here to replace her." "I know," he said. "But she would have trusted you. You gave them what she always prayed they'd have, someone who stays." They both stood quietly for a moment, listening to the steady breathing of the twins. "Thank you," David said finally. Sarah shook her head. "You don't thank family." Days turned into weeks, and the small progress kept coming. The twins learned how to point at things they wanted. They could lift small toys, turn pages, and hum when they were happy. Each sound was a small miracle. David no longer called the therapist every day. He didn't need proof anymore. He found it in the way his sons looked at him now with trust. And he found it in Sarah's quiet strength, the kind that didn't demand attention but changed everything around it. He started therapy himself, not for the boys but for his grief. He stopped running from pain and started living with it. The house no longer needed to be perfect. It just needed to be real. One bright morning, David stood in the garden beside a new swing set, something Linda had once wanted to build before she died. Now, 6 months later, it stood under the hydrangeas, simple and strong. Sarah helped the twins sit on it, while David stood behind, holding them steady. "Ready?" he asked softly. Ethan laughed. Ryan gripped his brother's hand tightly. David pushed gently, the swing creaking softly as it moved. Sarah joined them, placing her hands lightly on the boys' backs. No cameras. No nurses. No therapists. Just the four of them and the wind. The boys laughed again, soft, broken, but real. It was the kind of sound David knew he would carry with him forever. He looked at Sarah. She looked back. For a moment, everything stopped: the grief, the past, the fear. There was only peace. The mansion that once felt like a tomb now breathed again. The silence that once hurt now sounded like life. And the man who once believed money could fix everything had finally learned what healing really looked like: a Maid song, 2 small voices, and a house that finally learned how to love again. Dear viewers, this story reminds us that sometimes love doesn't come from who you expect. It comes from those who show up, stay, and care when the world gives up. David had money, but it was Sarah's presence, her patience, and her faith that brought life back into that home. And those 2 little boys, Ethan and Ryan, taught everyone that hope doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be believed in. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. What did you learn from Sarah's courage and David's change? Was it love, faith, patience, or presence? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story so more people can remember that no matter how dark life gets, love can still speak.